Hello once again, everyone, and welcome to part 2/3 of the Zettel. So last time we talked about the basics of the Zornhau and how we're getting into kind of our new bindy-windy mode and the things we will do there and from. Today we're going to clarify some of those as well as continue a train that we started last week but did not get into. And joining me this week is Ryan. So, when we last left off on the exciting train of the Zornhau, we had struck in against our opponent and started our winding. Now we had two different styles of winding. We could either go into my upper right opening, or I could pass into my upper left opening against his blade or around his blade, but not really around, right? So let's go ahead and go there again. So, the idea behind this is, I of course approach as always. He's going to strike in, I'm going to get my Zorn, so we're all going to get bind on bind. So my choice is, if he is in the middle here with me, then I can go ahead and just wind up through to hit him. If he's a little bit over more, so kind of lined up with his shoulder, but not quite pushing me off, then I wind the opposite way and get 1 point in. Now, this is all ringing a bell. We have a response from here that can then go further. So the idea here is, he may lift his shield in response to either of these two winds, and that can look like a couple different things. So, for reference, we'll go ahead and square up again. And we'll have Ryan do the initial wind, and I will show what those responses can look like. So, we're in here, we're in mutual bind. He winds against my blade this time. So, when the point is put into my face, I have two different responses. I can either lift my shield straight up, or alternatively, another thing you can do that I don't often see, well, I see it a lot, but I don't often see people apply it to this interpretation, is lifting my shield by going to more of an ox. Now, this will come into play again later, but the basic idea is it still does the same thing. I have a point in my face, so I put something in the way in one of two ways. Nothing too complicated. If he wound the other way, so around my blade, around my blade like I just did. There we go. The same thing applies without difficulty. So now what do we do in response to it? Well, when he lifts his shield, we're going to just let our point skip over with a little Durchwechseln, and I can place it in between his hands to his chest or to any other low opening, though here's kind of the sweet spot. So let's get there. We're both in the bind against each other, right? This time we go with the medium bind first. So I'm going to wind against his sword, and he's going to lift his shield up to defend. Okay? Now, he's lifted it up so that I can't hit him. All I'm going to do is let it drop underneath. And in this case, since I'm square to him, I can get this opening. If I'm a little bit more to the side, because I find a lot of people do like to sidestep as they do this, I go around his hands and instead place it into his chest. Alternatively, where here he locks down me a little bit more, not quite that far, right about there. I reach around, he lifts his hilt in one of those ways, same exact thing can apply, and I can be relatively safe. Now we talked about this before, I stepped in on that one. Nothing wrong with really doing so, especially in this context as he is in the process of lifting up. If you do this well in time, you can kind of fill that tempo, as it were. So I'll show that what I mean. We're here, he's kind of partially locking me down. As I lift and he lifts, right? If I make that one tempo, I missed my step. But if I make that one go, he's still in the process of going up by the time I'm in. I can then use my blade to jam out his arms, etc. But if I'm not going to do that, if I'm going to wait, then I may wish to step away rather than in. But either way, that's kind of the next simple point is he lifts his shield in one of those two ways, go around it, stab him. You could also add a bit of Zucken pulling to this if you wanted to, so what that could look like is, we'll go to here, I wind against his sword, he lifts, in response I'm going to pull it, then put it back in, rather than going around. It's really apples and oranges at that point. A Durchwechseln or a Zucken kind of achieves the same thing here. The important thing is that you then just place below. Now, this also brings us into the next section, which is a bit of a longer section, which is about the idea of cut, thrust, slice, the Durchwechseln. Now, this leads in also to the 24 windings, which we've talked about kind of briefly before. There are actually 8. All right? So to give detail about this, and Ryan, you can be the side-on view while I do this facing the camera. So, the main openings that we can wind through are our upper right opening, our upper left opening, but within that, those two can also be on either side of the blade. So if his blade's here, I'm winding around it. If his blade's here, I'm winding through it. My lower left opening and my lower right opening. This makes 4 times 2, 8. Within each of those, every time I do a wind, it could either be to cut, to thrust, or to slice. 3 times the 8, 24. Now, A little bit of math lesson aside, what does that actually practically look like? Because the advice you get is don't thrust when you should cut, don't cut when you should thrust, etc. Don't slice, blah, blah, blah. The basic idea, and this kind of gets more into the Duplieren and Mutieren, which we'll get to today, is sometimes you can do these actions as one thing or another. So let's, for example, look at me winding through his blade. So here, what we most often see is it as the stab. But it could also be doing that as a cut. Kind of a shill-how-like motion, but not necessarily. Another example would be, maybe my wind is pressing it onto his head so that I may slice. We see that in a lot of the grapple actions. It's just going to kind of depend upon what your opponent is doing at the time, which is also why I think that the text does not go into great detail about it. Because once you understand everything of these can be done as one form or the other, and then we proceed to do it in several other named instances, you kind of got the gist. Really, the most important thing here is that I am just getting building blocks that I can then put together in various combinations. The biggest game of yes and ever. Now, the next thing that we are taught in this regard is how to use the fray, how to hunt the next few openings. And this is where I've got to give another little shout out to Kurt Holtfetter. Right? His kind of hypothesis is that there's this focus on the hanging, which that is what the text says. Most all of the fighting comes from the idea of the hanging, right? Out here, where the hangings are being done, right? Or technically, you could also go here or here. But either way, I do believe this is on the right track. Almost all good fencing goes to some point of extension. The idea here being that I have many ways of entering into extension, and then from there I can hunt him reliably. Because odds are, if I could just free cut this guy, like all he's going to do when I cut in is just block me, right? Well, we already learned what to do against that guy, right? That's all the stuff you should know section. Or, again, if all he's going to do is just block me, then in theory, me just knowing how to throw a really good Zorn should put most of the fear into him, and then just doing a simple wind off of that should finish him. Odds are, people like that are not going to last very long, right? So instead, kind of the next tier up above, you could maybe even attach this to the common fencer thing, but I'm not going to. The next tier up are going to be people who now understand, keeping to the lessons that we know, keep the shield in front of the head, don't fence from left and right, blah, blah, blah. They are going to end up in Bindsmore. Once you end up in Bindsmore, you need a way to hunt them down. So here is going to be a way of doing so. And the example we get is a relatively long one that does a really good job of just showing how some of these little jumps can be done. So let's switch sides real quick. So the example we are given is we're going to wind through all four openings. We're going to start upper right, lower left, and then finally the upper left. This is one example of many, but it does kind of get the idea across. So for this, we'll go ahead and start in bind, right? My first wind is I'm going to go ahead and wind to my upper right, so I will turn. He does not like this and goes to see it off. The way he sees it off is what we just talked about, so I lower my point. He goes to get rid of that. I can next lower my point by stepping across and going to the new opening. He goes to sell that, and then finally I can wind through to the other side. This is the way I do this particular train. Now, what you end up seeing from that is a couple different things. The first wind goes around his blade. The second wind goes to the inside of his blade because see how he must block it. The third wind, you can actually do a couple different things. I could actually turn over here into Flug if I wish, and will achieve the same exact idea, or I can choose to just step and switch my tip to give him more of a threat to push him across. Then finally I can wind through here, or if I want to, I could also do another little disengage and go through on the inside. The important thing here is it doesn't really necessarily matter how I hunt those four openings. The important thing is that I'm always staying kind of one step ahead of him and just working him around back and forth. The same exact thing is true in driving with cutting, right? When I throw a cut from one side, he's going to have a block. So then I throw a cut from the other side, then I throw a cut from the other side, and then finally I take a third opening, right? I'm bringing him from one side to the other, etc., etc. The same is true here, right? I brought him high, I bring him low again, and I bring him high. He's never really able to prevent me from getting him. Now, I will say that the way I do it tends to lead to me being on the outside of the circle more than the inside. This isn't necessarily a problem. You can still do it on the inside, but the important thing is if someone is more comfortable holding that center line against you, but not necessarily in an aggressive or counter way, this is a very good way to get around him, and we see this a lot in master fighting. Either way, though, that's kind of the next section, that idea of just hunting through those 4 openings. You know, you can also cross hatch and do a lot of different fun things with that. Basically, anything you could think you could do with a cut, do it with a point. And you've got the basic idea. Now, the next thing that we kind of get into is going to be 2 devices with that in mind. An example of the bindings that is more of a named instance, because they do put a suffix and then we'll literally come back to all the winding stuff later in the book. For now, the next thing we're going to start tackling is Duplieren and Mutieren, which also come well off of what we just talked about. So think of this as, that was the stuff we should know for this lesson. Here's now some bits to build off of it. So firstly, Duplieren. The idea here is, rather than winding around, we will cut around. So I end up in a good bind against him, right? And for this, we're going to have him down, so he's locking me down just a little bit more off to his side, right? Kind of here-ish. So remember I talked about how we were either in the middle, my tip was over his right arm, or my tip was over his left arm. Currently, my tip is over his right arm. Now, if he's stagnant, if he's just holding the middle ground, I'm better off winding around or through or what have you. But if he is in the act of then continuing to apply pressure, or possibly even looking to apply more, this is where I cut, right? If he's strong, don't stay there. But rather than raking around, I will rake through. Now the way I achieve this is I slightly lift my right hand. This does not have to be dramatic. This is mostly so that as he pushes down, go ahead and start pushing on my blade, you'll notice he starts gaining the flat and my hand starts opening. If as he's doing that, I lift my sword, he still feels the same thing, but I'm not opening. So, as he does so, I'm going to lift my right hand, I'm going to push my pommel hard underneath until my blade is flat. This will allow me then to be lined up to cut his face. Now here's the tricky part. In doing Mutieren, because I didn't believe in doing Duplieren, I didn't believe Duplieren worked for many years, even though we went over it, in class where I learned. I didn't necessarily buy it until finally I got the idea. You don't cut a Duplieren. He cuts the Duplieren. You're just behind it. What I mean by that is, if I try to aim for him, it starts extending. Yes, maybe I hit him, but it's not a Duplieren anymore. It's more of just me throwing another cut. And that's unreliable because I don't have control of his blade. Instead, I let him push me, and I just sort of slide into place behind his blade, and that's what drags it through his face. There's a couple different styles of footwork you can do with this. I can either do a small oblique step, or I can pass forward. I'm a very tall guy, so I prefer to do the oblique step rather than the pass because I don't want to cover too much distance, but you could do either one without difficulty. So we're in bind once again. He's locking me down a little bit more and still pressing. Lift, turn, and it should just slot. If you try to aim it with your right hand, you're going to miss or you're going to leave his blade. Just push your pommel out to the side and sort of fall into the gap that you made, and you will cut through. Then you can just roll out and do whatever you need to do. Now, I will say, once you learn this, you will be tempted to do it a lot. Don't. The best times to use it are either when you're in bind work and someone is overpressing, or alternatively, if you strike in super strongly and he's really locking down, because I'm far enough away from him, then I can maybe force this a bit more. But even then, that's only in very extreme circumstances. Either way, though. Let's show that one more time on this side, and then we'll switch sides. So, we're in bind. He's locking me down some more, right? And I feel his pressure. Lift, fall into the hole, see you cut. Now we'll switch sides. We're bound against each other. Boom. He's locking me down. Lift. Just drop it into the hole. And sometimes he'll turn as a thrust, sometimes he'll turn as a cut. Kind of depends upon exactly where the pressure is. But the important thing is I'm just clipping him on the right side of his face as I go through. Now, that's the classic Duplieren. And it works well to both sides. But that's not the only Duplieren we get. We also get another Duplieren. This one is one I actually had to use at Surfo. So if you watch the footage that I put up, you may see it. So the idea here is that it comes out of me slightly overbinding him. So the idea is he cuts, but I get more here. So my tip is kind of past him. Now, if your tip is more here, there's your Zorn order. But if my tip is more kind of behind his head, right, then I don't want to pull back to try and get my point in line. Instead, what I will do, and especially if he's starting to give pressure, because he's going to need to, I'm going to wind, but I'm going to wind to slice. So I'm going to lift my arms up, and then push my tip behind the sword, so that way it cuts him in the back of the head / the top of the head as I roll off. The idea here being, because of how he's pressing in, I prevent him from locking me down and thus being forced back to the middle by winding, because he doesn't have leverage in the tip of the sword. And then the fastest way for me to get my point on line is just to bring that short edge back in. This also has the added benefit of starting to tilt his head, and we will see it a lot in various styles of wrestling when it comes to getting your sword on people's necks. So, same thing again. I've managed to kind of get past his head a little deeper than I want to be, right? I feel that pressure, so I wind up, and I just get that sword on the top corner of his head. I'd even like it to be more here, but here is still totally okay. And then as he continues to press, he is continuing to cut himself. Now, I am not pulling here. What I'm not doing is this, neither am I really pushing my palm. Both those will move him, but really what I'm more doing is as he pushes into the blade, I'm just keeping what I've got firm, and then if I want to cut through, I do a little bit of torso turn, which will turn him. This also lends very well into defending myself, because at any point, if he does manage to get clear, I've got my shield in front of my face, I can then roll out with various cuts. One more addendum, though. One of the things I see my students do a lot with this, at least when they first start out, is they want to then cut the head on the other side. So what that would look like is this. We're in bind, boom, right? A little more open, right? A little more here. There we go. And he's giving me pressure, and I lift up and I get my cut, and it goes through, and then I cut again. That's fine, but if you saw my getting more out of Ferdinand, the last video I just did of it, if I do that second cut, I'm stuck in the pocket for another tempo, because I chose to hit him. Meaning, if he's not dead, which, again, people don't die these days, I now have to spend even more time exiting. Alternatively, and it's not as safe an exit, if I get this hit here, and he continues to push, I can then exit to center line as I leave. If he tries to follow me, he's not going to get through that. I've got a lot of stuff here. And I could maybe blow on the hands or get something nicer. My point is, it is safer. You already got a great hit. Leave. Get out of there, right? Only stay in if he's really, really pushing. But even then, if he's really, really pushing, you can just exit that way. This isn't necessarily saying that you couldn't get that second cut. I just caution against it, because then you're going to be stuck in for one more tempo. But let's switch sides again to show this one. So, he strikes in, boom, I get kind of over, I'm going to wind, catch, there's on his head, and then as he continues to push through, I can just bring back to center. One more time. He cuts, boom, I'm through, up, through, right? And it's reliant on his pressure. If he's not pushing me, then I shouldn't go for it. But if he is, I just snake it behind and get that hit. So, that's the two versions of Duplieren, and they're both great. You notice they're also both come from your right side. I'm not necessarily doing the Duplieren purely on the left, it's just I happen to hit the other side of his head, which is kind of cool. But either way. The next that we're going to go over is Mutieren. Now, Mutieren is one of those wherein I find him weak in the bind. This can mean a couple different things. So, we're here. Weak could mean, if he's overall weak, like just not even really there, I can just stab him. So that isn't the case. What it is more about his leverage and pressure. So if he is more at an angle where his hands feel strong, but I know that his tip has very little leverage because it's disconnected from him, then this is the thing I can exploit. Now, I could just wind through it, but the problem is because he's so weak, this doesn't really make as much sense, right? Not to mention, he'll probably just push that to the side, right? Instead, what I can do is, since he is weak there, I can take that opening and then go low. Now, you can do it out of this position that I currently have Ryan into, but the problem with that is that while I can get it, and I can even get something pretty sweet out of it, it's always going to be very flat. And while I do think that is absolutely valid and a Mutieren by definition, I don't find that to be very common. Instead, what I find to be a lot more common is that people go into that kind of parrying ox that we talked about earlier. So if you remember, we were here, and I wound against him, and he went kind of up into ox to get my point out of his face. This is a lot more common, and this is also weak. This has very little leverage out of the tip, right? Even more so when his hands are highest, and his tip is slightly low. That's super easy to push down. So, with that in mind, we're in the bind, and I find him weak, right? Because he's got his shield in front of his face. This could also be from me being here, but I'll go for here. I'm going to instead direct over toward his weak, lift with my pommel to the outside, which gets me angled out, and then I deliver the thrust with my body. This can also be used as a counter to a wind. I'll get back to that again in a moment. But, point being, bind doesn't always have to necessarily be here, right? Especially if I'm super strong and I came in with a cut. Ryan may be very well aware that I can do all this stuff in the middle line, so he's just going to lock stuff down, right? Where here, he knows what's about to happen, so he goes ahead and keeps his schilt in front of his face by going up into this ox-like position. I realize he just made himself weak, so I take my Mutieren. And this works to both sides, because it may happen on both sides depending upon how the cut comes up. But, either way, the biggest thing about making the Mutieren successful for you is going to be taking your time with it and doing these key 3 steps. So step number 1, we're in bind, identify that he's weak. I like to do this off of someone going up in this parrying ox. But number 2, I'm going to tank turret first. So I got to draw my edge back to the tip. If I'm tight on him, this can be done with here. Alternatively, I can do a little bit of movement at the same time. But I draw it across. Next, I'm going to push my pommel out toward his tip. So I'm not just lifting it, I'm pushing it out away from me so that I'm looking at my hands. This allows me to angle it downward. And then finally, I deliver this thrust by moving my whole body forward into him, not by lunging. While I can still deliver that like this, it will cause my hands to lower, and if his hands are particularly high, he may get enough strength to kind of see that off. So, one more time with completion. We zorn in, he's afraid of my point, so he lifts, over, through, in. Nice and solid. And I'm standing well away from my hands, which means he's all locked up and really can't go anywhere. From the other side, everything's exactly the same, just his hands will be crossed, so we don't really need to show that. But we will show this from a different perspective. So, we bind in, boom, maybe I start to wind, who knows, he lifts up, oh, there's my opportunity, in against him. Now, the thing you want to watch out for here is that at the moment, my hands are out, my body's out, and my foot and my tip are kind of on the same line going inward. So I'm kind of like doing a pincer on him. This I find is good because it means for him to defend himself, he has to do a seriously large motion. But if instead I am more parallel to my tip, right, or further back to my tip, him being able to step up into his left side, so go ahead and start moving around, is a lot easier. Him also being able to push that blade out of presence is easier because I'm no longer going over his blade and holding him, like, you know, like a band. It's much more of I'm just at him, which can be redirected to the center line. But either way, we'll talk more about that in a separate video that will be less Zettel involved, but more just general advice involved. Anyway though, I mentioned earlier about countering the whine. So let's go over that real quick. This is not necessarily written down, but I do find it is a useful time to use this as well for the Mutieren. When someone whines uselessly against you. So some people will whine by default because it's one of the first things you learn, at least in the German system. So we cut in, boom, and he's just automatically whining. Now, if he's doing a good whine, then the point should already kind of be at me and I will have to go into the mouth. But if he's not, he's just going up because that's what he's been taught to do. This is the perfect time to do Mutieren because he just made himself weak. And I find that this one happens almost instantaneously. So, the only reason, in fact, I can assume it's not in the book is probably because, well, people didn't whine uselessly, right? But either way, let's show that again a little bit more sequentially. So we bind in, he just immediately starts whining, so I just go ahead and take that opening. And I find this is not necessarily meant to be a counter to a whine, but a counter to a useless whine. So if you know someone that does this, try it out against them, see how it works. Either way though, so the things that we covered, to reiterate, we went over the idea of starting to go through the different openings as we attacked. We went over the idea of how those different openings can then be used as a cut, a thrust, or a slice. And then we showed examples in both the Mutieren and the Duplieren on both sides. The only thing we didn't show is, of course, the Mutieren on this side, which is exactly the same. Either way, though, thank you very much, Ryan. And thank you all very much for watching. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover out of the Zornhaus section, because that is the complete Zornhaus section. Next up would be Krumfau. I'm going to take a little bit of time before I do it, kind of refresh myself on it, refresh my students on it before we go over it, as I'm kind of running this parallel to their class. I may do one where I talk a little bit about the escape from the Mutieren, because it's not necessarily out of the source, but it is something to be wary of when you start using it, and it's one that I don't often hear talked about. So I may do a separate kind of like bonus episode for this about it. Either way though, thank you very, very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.